All right, so that video was actually a very good treatment of the founding of the movement, and as you could see from the from its general tone, it tended to be heroic and focused on Chavez and Dolores Huerta, both of whom were terribly significant figures. What it kind of glossed over a little bit is that there had been, starting in 1959, an effort supported by the American Federation of Labor to organize workers in the Central Valley. And this particular slide is Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino who was behind that movement. And AWOC stands for Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, and that was a branch of the AFL-CIO. And in 1955, the Filipino Farm Labor Union was founded by representatives from the American Federation of Labor. Now, it was always a small effort, and it didn't really get to the community beyond the Filipino workers, but it was there, and it was a very, very important part of the effort to organize the workers. And there's Itliong himself as he's announcing the strike in 1965. So at that point, when as the video said, when the strike was announced, Chavez and Huerta had the choice of, do we kind of stick by ourselves? They had formed their own mini union, but they hadn't really done anything with it yet. Or do we support the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee? And they decided, as the video said, to support the Filipino workers. And Itliong also remained a very, very important part of the union. And the new union was called the United Farm Workers because it was a union of the Filipino Union and the Chavez Huerta Union. So that's why it's called the UFW, the United Farm Workers, because it was a union of two of those. And of course, Chavez himself was from the Navy. There's a very famous Navy person during World War II, and there's Chavez. You saw that picture from the video. He had served in the Navy during the Second World War, and he had he actually had settled. Actually, he was from Yuma, Arizona, then lived in Delano for a while, but ended up settling in San Jose. And in the early in the 1950s, he was approached by somebody. This particular guy, I showed you this picture. Let me go move it over there. I showed you this picture when we were talking about the Depression. That's Woody Guthrie at the Arvin Labor Camp outside of Bakersfield in '39. And that particular camp was the model for the camp that John Steinbeck chronicled in The Grapes of Wrath. The guy who's standing to his right is named Fred Ross. He was the guy who was actually in charge of the camp itself. He was a sort of a social worker, but after the war, he became involved in community organizing, and he actually was tutored by the fellow on the left, Saul Alinsky, who was a community organizer in Chicago. And during the 40s, Alinsky had founded, Ross had actually, working for Alinsky, had founded an organization called the Community Service Organization. And the idea was to increase Latino voter registration and political presence in Southern California, which at that time was where most of the Latinos lived. And in fact, what they did was they were the force behind Edward Roybal becoming the first Hispanic member of the Los Angeles City Council. And then in the late 40s or early 50s, I forget when exactly, Roybal became the first Mexican American to be elected to the U.S. Congress. Alinsky's way of community organizing was, he said, okay, find out what the community is interested in. And even if you think it's absolutely irrelevant to the larger efforts, organize around that. And once you get the community organized, then you can kind of try to bring them along to your side. But you're not going to organize them if you come in and say, we have to deal with X, Y, and Z, if the people in the community don't think that X, Y, and Z are important. And so what Ross did in Southern California in the 40s was he basically said what's important. And a lot of times, the thing that was regarded as important was that, we don't have any elected Mexicans to represent us in city government. So organizing around voter registration was the real important thing. Now, I remember actually, in the 1950s, in New York, in the parish that I grew up in, called St. Columba's on West 25th Street, most of us lived between 9th and 10th Avenues, in 25th and 26th Street. And St. Columba's School was on 25th Street between 9th and 8th. So we had to cross 9th Avenue to go to school, and there was no traffic light there. Nowadays, of course, every intersection in New York City has a traffic light, but it wasn't the case back then. And for some reason, I forget why, one of the priests in the parish who was a Spanish-speaking priest, so maybe it was connected with voter registration, had invited an Alinsky representative to come and talk. And so he did what Alinsky said. What are you guys interested in? And they wanted a traffic light so their kids would not be hit by cars when they were crossing 9th Avenue and 25th Street to go to school. And so what this Alinsky organizer did was he organized all of the mothers. And these are young mothers whose husbands had fought in World War II. And basically, he organized them all. So basically, what they did, one day they simply got all of their strollers together, and there were about 50 of them, and they just simply crossed and recrossed 9th Avenue and 25th Street and tied up traffic completely. And it was covered in the newspapers and everything like that. And sure enough, a couple of months later, there was a traffic light on that corner. And I remember my mother and all of the people mothers of the kids that I grew up with, walking their strollers back and forth. They go from one side of 9th Avenue to the other side, and they immediately turn around and go back. So you had this continuous line of people. But it was a perfect example of Alinsky's method, find out what the community is interested in, and then kind of go and do it. And so that's what voter registration was. So Ross, what he did in 1952 is there's a picture of the community service organization, a meeting in the Valley in 1955, and there you can see Ross is the one right there. Well, he comes up to San Jose around this time. And Chavez is living in San Jose, and Ross had heard that Chavez had this past, in Delano, desegregating the movie theater. So he went to him, and he got him involved in the community service organization. And so what Chavez did is he spent a good part of the mid-1950s working for voter registration drives in East San Jose. And then, as the video said, Dolores Huerta was doing analogous kinds of things, working for the community service organization in Stockton, and they got together in the early '60s. And as they were talking, they decided, they knew about the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, but they thought that it was a little bit, that to organize Mexican workers, you needed a little bit more. The AFL was a classical union, but you needed more than just simply classical union organizing. You needed, and this is where the Alinsky thing, you needed to figure out what the community was interested in. And the community was interested in religion, it was interested in faith, it was interested in family, and all of those kinds of things. And that becomes a major part, as the video indicated, of the early days of the union. So this Chavez organizing and you can see that its thing is for voting, voter registration, and so what happens is that they start the National Farm Workers Association, and from the very beginning, it's a kind of a bilingual sort of thing. The movement. The march from from Delano to Sacramento, the video kind of gives the impression that it was just sort of happened. No, it was well prepared, and it was time to start the day after Kennedy's visit, because they figured that when Robert Kennedy came to Delano or came to Kern County, there would be a lot of national press that would come. And so what they did was, at the same day that Kennedy was holding these hearings, a number of union organizers were briefing the national news media on the beginning of this march, which was scheduled to happen the very next day. So it was a well-organized kind of thing. It wasn't just, oh, let's go to Sacramento and see what we can figure out. But they did, follow their, as the graphic indicates, they follow very, Our Lady of Guadalupe is a huge thing in Mexican American communities, and so they followed Our Lady of Guadalupe down Highway 99 and through those back roads and all of those places. And actually, the march ended up not at the Capitol. The march ended up in Sacramento at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, where they had a big mass before they went off to the Capitol. So there's Chavez in 1966, just as the thing is getting started. There's the hearing. He has a hearing in Sacramento, and he actually, the fact that the union is organized. So Walter Reuther, who was one of the major leaders of the in the AFL-CIO and was head of the automobile union, the UAW. There they are there he is marching with Chavez and Larry Itliong. And they did, in 1966, Shenley agreed to negotiate with them. And that was a big, big breakthrough. And Shenley agreed to have a vote, and the UFW, the United Farm Workers, won the vote. The other people, it turns out that the Teamsters were also involved in that vote, and a lot of the people who were driving trucks voted for the Teamsters, and the Teamsters and the rivalry between the Teamsters and the UFW will become very, very prominent in the 1970s. But after '66, it wasn't. There wasn't a lot of other stuff going on. So Chavez tried a number of things. There he is, ending a hunger strike in March of 1968. Bobby Kennedy is there, and typically. He ended the hunger strike with receiving communion at Mass. But as the video, pointed out, he came to the realization that, to get the strike being won, you had to do more kinds of things than simply organize in the fields. And so the strategy that finally proved successful for them was the national boycott of grapes strategy. There's some people picketing stores in Milwaukee, and the boycott strategy was all over the country. That was possible because the National Labor Relations Act, which had been signed by President Roosevelt in 1935, had outlawed secondary boycotts. A primary boycott is, if you are on strike, if you're the auto worker, say, and you're on strike against General Motors, you can't picket General Motors plants and everything like that. That's a primary boycott, and you offer people not to buy General Motors cars, and things like that. You can picket the car dealers and everything like that. But you cannot picket, that's a primary boycott, but you cannot picket a store which happens to sell General Motors products. That was part of the negotiation that went on with to get the National Labor Relations passed. The industry, the unions were given you can do primary boycotts, but the industries were given you can't do secondary boycotts. So those are illegal, except that when the National Labor Relations Act was passed, one group of laborers was specifically exempted from that, and those were agricultural laborers. They were specifically exempted from the National Labor Relations Act. And the reason was that the New Deal coalition under President Roosevelt consisted of two parts. There were Northern liberals, and there were Southern Democrats who at that time were segregationists. And Roosevelt kind of had to try to hold these people together. And one of the prices of getting Southern Democrats' support for the National Labor Relations Act was to specifically say that agricultural workers would not be affected by this act. And why was that? Well, who were agricultural workers in the South? They were black sharecroppers. And the Southern Democrats, who were segregationists, did not want black sharecroppers to be unionized. And so what happens is that the fact that the secondary boycott is not illegal in terms of farm laborers means that Chavez and the union can, in fact, use it, even though it's illegal for virtually every other segment of labor communities. It's not illegal for agricultural laborers, and that's basically what wins the strike for them. And Chavez becomes kind of a national figure. One of the great issues here is that what happens to the union.